you're trying to get your tone names to appeal to the millennials. This is your problem. It's really a branding issue for the submedian, that it doesn't appeal to the millennials.
I wouldn't even say it's the millennials. I would say it is like the even younger generation than that.
You know how I got it to appeal to my students? By saying, there's some theory about why this is called, these things are called these things, but we're not going to go over it. Just memorize it. It's not that hard.
Don't worry about it.
Nate, you're crunching. And now I do not see Nate.
Crunch, crunch, crunch.
Nope.
Okay. Well, I'll just do that each time, I guess.
What are you doing?
I'm just restarting, or like, select something, some other audio device, and then go back.
That's pretty weird.
Yeah.
That sucks.
All right. Well,
I might keep my microphone muted when I'm not talking, just so that it doesn't like come up.
All right.
I'll try to say something and then see if it's crunchy, then we can approach it. Then.
All right.
Sound okay?
Sounds good.
Cool.
I'm hearing some feedback. Do you have headphones?
Yeah.
What's that? Say it again. Say it into the microphone. I got 2 of them, and they don't like any feedback. They're making a Joe Dirt too, by the way.
Okay. My speakers are off.
Oh.
Okay. All right. Here we go. It's going to be me, and then Nate, and then Sam, and then Ben. Everybody ready?
Right.
Yep. In 3. This is SoundNotion, the weekly podcast for new music and music news. I'm David McDonald.
I'm Nate Blyton.
I'm Sam Merciers.
And I'm Ben Furman.
And this week on the show, we've got some really interesting news. We've got a little bit of follow-up from our discussion on opera last week. But we're going to start by letting you all know. I know we've got a lot of performers and composers that listen to the show, that the New Music Gathering, which is in its 2nd year, is going to be hosted at the Peabody Conservatory in Baltimore this year, has just posted their schedule of events. There's some really cool stuff there, and you should check that out, newmusicgathering.org, and we will have a link to the schedule in our show notes. This is a really cool event, and I hope it continues to occur, and I hope that it continues to move so that eventually it will slowly make its way closer and closer to where I live in Florida. Because last year it was in San Francisco, and this year it's in Baltimore, so it can't get a lot farther than it has been the last 2 times. So come down south, guys. It's going to be cool. Actually, it's going to be warm, but that's exactly in January when you want to be down here. It's going to be great.
Yes. Lots of percussion this year, which is good.
Well, and there's also the collaboration between Jay Batzner and Tammy Evans-Yance, so that will definitely involve computers of some sort. That should be really interesting.
Yeah, it's a very cool project, and I like it very much. So come down here. Also, we read this week about the founding of a new orchestra in the UK called Chineke, the founding by Chichi Nwanoku, and it is an orchestra that is going to be composed entirely of black and minority ethnic musicians, which is very cool. We've talked in the past about the race issues in classical music. It is not something that we talk about enough, but perhaps that is because it is so overwhelming that it's hard to imagine where to start addressing such a problem. And we've actually even talked about it specifically in Europe, and there are a lot of orchestras in Europe where it's hard even to find women in the orchestra. And so this is very cool that this is an orchestra made up entirely of black and minority ethnic musicians that is founded by a woman, Nwanoku. And it's going to be very cool. It's modeled on the Sphinx organization, which we've talked about a lot before. They're a Detroit-based group of classical musicians in the United States. And I don't know, would you guys have any thoughts on this new orchestra? The Chineke Orchestra? Chineke exclamation point, by the way.
Mm. It's just worth pointing out in that context that it wasn't until, I'm pretty sure, and if somebody sends your hate mail directly to me, that the Vienna Philharmonic, until sometime in the 90s, the 1990s, didn't allow women in the
No,
orchestra.
and we spoke in on this show a couple of years ago about a woman who had written about how difficult it was for her to get tenure in that organization and for her to reach a principal chair in that organization. I mean, this is kind of what I was hinting at earlier. I didn't want to call anybody out, but yeah, the Vienna Philharmonic is kind of famous for not being the most progressive with their diversity.
Well,
Yes, go ahead, Ben.
Oh, I was going to say, it's really nice to see more diversity in general in classical music. I mean, this is a huge, huge issue. And yeah, we do have organizations in the U.S. like Sphinx and then the Harlem Quartet, but it still is a huge gap, and one that is really kind of needs to be bridged in order to appeal to a larger audience.
Well, and the exciting thing about these organizations, both Sphinx and Chineke, is that they are really emphasizing education. To me,
Right.
this is one of the things that the Sphinx does that's so cool, is they've got their annual competition, and they've got these student chamber ensembles and student orchestras. And the write-up that we'll post from The Independent about Chineke mentions El Sistema, which has, all of its kind of satellite versions around the world now from Venezuela. This is, if you're unfamiliar with El Sistema, it is an educational orchestra musician system that's based in Venezuela, where there are a number of different levels of orchestras, and students kind of graduate from one to the other, and students in the higher level ensembles teach the students in the beginner ensembles, and it's a very efficient way to get students into classical music, and it has in the past developed some really outstanding musicians that have either reached the top levels of that organization and just played some amazing music, and also kind of graduated from that organization and gone on to be pretty astounding professional musicians. Most notably, perhaps Gustavo Dudamel of the Los Angeles Philharmonic is a product of El Sistema. And you can there have been some really interesting documentaries and books written about this program, and other programs in other countries have been built as using El Sistema as a model, and there are a few of these in Europe and in the United Kingdom, and it's something that comes up in this discussion of Chineke, and something like that could help bring new musicians in, because that's really the problem, right? The issue is not that there are all of these black classical musicians that can't get a job in an orchestra, though I'm sure that is an issue for a lot of people. The bigger issue is that there are not as many people who are looking for those jobs, and we need to take it upon ourselves to make more of those people. And so
Right.
this is a way to do that, as is Sphinx. I would say that in everything I've read about Sphinx, they would probably describe themselves as much as anything as an educational organization.
Right, and tangential to that, it also helps to create a new audience. I mean, there's something to be said for having, a group of musicians that resembles their target audience when they're performing, and that's able to bridge cultural and racial gaps in order to expand the audience for classical music.
It can only do good things. And in connection with new music, as I've pointed out before, it seems to me that new perspectives, and when you get people from different cultural backgrounds, you're going to start getting new thoughts about new music. So to me,
absolutely.
This is investing in new music of the future.
Yeah.
Definitely a more is better kind of approach, yeah, with people and cultures, bringing more in, getting more people involved. It's great.
Yes. Tangentially related to that, and certainly not nearly as, I'd say, profound, but interesting. I live down here, so you guys probably aren't familiar with the $1 Million Band. Do you know who that is? That is the University of Alabama marching band. And I had the the honor actually of going to a game last year when my alma mater, the University of Tennessee Chattanooga, was served up as a sacrificial lamb / money-making scheme for both teams.
You know, sometimes that doesn't always work out well for the other team.
Exactly the way the odds makers said, by 60 points. They hit it right on the head. But that place knows how to put on a football game. And as an extension of that, the $1 million band, the marching band at Alabama, really knows how to put on a show. This year, for the first year in its 103-year existence, they have 4 drum majors, and all 4 of them are women. Savannah Smith, Holly Kinsey, Jessica Palmer, and Kayla Sisko. So 103 years, I'm sure they've had female drum majors before, but they're all women this time, so good for them.
Speaking of groups paying a lot of money to have less good teams come and get beat by them in university athletics, this happened a couple of times yesterday, but most notably, the University of Nebraska paid Brigham Young University $1 million, literally $1 million, to come and play one game at the University of Nebraska, and guess who won the football game? The Brigham Young Cougars.
Yeah.
And really?
Yes.
Wow.
Yep.
I hadn't heard about that.
The Cornhuskers paid $1 million to lose a football game.
That is delicious.
Yeah.
Speaking of things that cost a lot of money, we've talked before about the precarious situation of the Steinway Piano Company, and they were sold to an investment company in 2013, and there were a lot of concerns about the quality of the instruments and whether they would be able to continue to make the kinds of amazing machines that people have come to expect from Steinway. And of course, there was the big to-do of the Steinway showroom being eventually sold and then leased back to Steinway, and then their lease ended, and now it's going to be this fancy pants apartment condo thingy. Now we don't really know what the future of super crazy high-end pianos are. And Anne Majette posted a really fascinating piece in the Washington Post this week about Steinway and what its future is, and the kind of bizarre stranglehold that it has had on the high-end piano market over the last century, seemingly. And the market share for Steinway and Sons, New York, whatever, is something like 98% in major concert halls.
Well, and she does note that 98% is based on Steinway's own self-reporting.
Sure.
So,
but still, I think we can all agree, anecdotally at least, that you see Steinways most places you go.
Right. Yeah. And if anybody has been involved with a Steinway school program at all, they are super intense about the Steinway only thing, which is weird, but I think it's a little bit like Apple giving away Macs in schools or selling them really cheap for schools like they used to, because you're training young people to know how this particular machine works so that when they graduate and they get to decide what the machine is going to be down the road, what the instrument is going to be down the road, they're going to Steinway first. And so that's really helped to perpetuate the dominance of Steinway across the industry. But it's important to note as well that there are plenty of smaller, I hesitate to call them boutique manufacturers because they're making such amazing expensive things, but they kind of are. I'm talking about what's the Italian company, Fazioli, and the big German one is Bösendorfer. And it's really interesting to see, and I love going to halls that have these other pianos, and not even mass-produced pianos like Yamaha's can be very, very lovely.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Yamaha makes very high-end concert grands too.
The C-Series Grand is amazing.
Yeah, no. I'm not saying that. I'm talking about just the scale of the company of Yamaha is much closer, obviously, to Steinway, at least in the piano department. I mean, Yamaha makes also like locomotives, but
they make everything.
Everything. Yeah.
There's an old Onion article about Yamaha that's pretty funny that you should look
I saw it
up.
floating around recently about talking about their weed eaters and golf clubs and keyboards and saxophones.
Yeah.
Yeah, they make fantastic saxophones, just for the record, and cheaper. Right. And this is related. I'm working my way back, Dave. Don't worry. They make fantastic saxophones that are less expensive than Selmer, which Selmer would be like the Steinway of the saxophone world.
Sure.
They're traditionally held as the best. Still manufactured. The top end ones are manufactured in Europe. But they're more expensive, and I don't think the intonation is good. And this is from someone who both plays and has worked on both models extensively. And even if they were the same price, I would buy a Yamaha. But that's a hard sell with a lot of people. You have kids come in, and their parents are going to fork out some cash and get them like the saxophone because they're going to college. Mm-hmm. And this is like, Ma and Pa six-pack coming in who don't know anything about anything but have used the Google machine, and the stranglehold that Selmer has is such that even through just general picking around, they come to the conclusion that Selmer is the way to go. And I would say that's very analogous to what's going on here.
Yeah, that's absolutely the position that Steinway's in. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, well, there's definitely some of that, too, in actually trying different instruments and doing A/B comparison. I mean, it's harder to do with pianos, obviously. But
it's almost impossible to do with pianos. How many even if you were picking within the Steinway category, how many pianos do you get to go in and try?
Right.
Maybe 4, unless you're going to the really super fancy places in big cities.
Right. I mean, the last time that I bought an instrument, I was sitting in a room doing A/B comparisons between about 30 different instruments, and I had other people in there as well giving me their perspective. But that's smaller, that's not a piano. Obviously, you're not going to have a room with 40 different pianos in that you can try.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and like many of these other brands, I can't imagine the context in which I'd be able to actually try like a Fazioli or whatever. And like I work at a university, and I'm the guy who manages the pianos and the purchasing of pianos. And we've got Steinways and Yamahas, and that's basically all I've ever been able to look at and work with. And even like the piano stores around here, I'm pretty sure don't have some of these other kinds. They kind of like, there's a Steinway store, a Yamaha brand store, and other things like that.
Does GVSQ have a piano deal?
So they aren't a Steinway school, but we've also been heavily pitched to be that, and I've had to field those phone calls and stuff like and it's an interesting thing. The marketing is definitely really heavy for sure.
So I teach at the University of Central Florida, and we are a Steinway school. Yeah. And for a while, I don't know if we still have it, for a while we were like testing a not Steinway piano in the hall, and that was like kind of controversial, and we were probably not supposed to like have it on stage, or if we were probably not supposed to have it say any word on the front of it that was not Steinway.
Or if you do have it
really in giant letters, because this is what they do, right? You got to see what the brand of the piano is from the back row. It was very clear that it was not a Steinway, but it sounded great, and all the pianists went ape nuts for it, and it was, you know what? Yeah, never mind. They went crazy for this thing, and but I think our contract with Steinway is never going to change, and so there's a lot of lock-in here. Another really cool thing that I'm sure Sam picked up on this and went nuts for in this article is how adventurous a lot of the non-Steinway manufacturers are with trying new things, because the piano is on a continuum. It's not like the violin pretty much stopped. We have violins, and we figured out how to make pretty good ones in like the 16th century, and we haven't really changed much about the violin in the last 500 years. But the piano has been on this really kind of slow progression of improving technology. It's a much more complex machine, obviously. The reason the violin stopped is because it's not a very complicated machine. It doesn't have basically any moving parts except for tuning pegs. And the piano has about 1,000 billion moving parts, and that's a rough estimate.
I think it's only 18,000. But
okay, well, whatever. I'm rounding up. The,
1,000 billion 50, I think.
Yeah.
Right?
whatever. Anyway, they're really, really complex, and so to me, I think it makes sense that we can continue to find ways to improve them. And some of the manufacturers are going pretty far with that and changing, playing around with different materials and playing around with different, organizations of the strings. And obviously, if you've ever written for anything that uses extended piano, you know that the player's access to the string area is going to be different depending on the kind of piano that you're dealing with as well, which is very problematic. But there's so much innovation just in like the number of keys. I'm sure if you haven't seen one, you really should, and if you can play it even better. The extended Bösendorfer piano with the extra like sixth or so at the end of the range, where the piano normally stops on A, and some of these pianos will go down to the C below that.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes it's like covered with like a little box or something, so that a pianist who's not using them doesn't have to have it like mess up their peripheral vision of where the end of the keyboard is.
Right. And it gives you the A, B flat, and B natural, A0 and its accompanying, gives them some company. They're hanging down there all by themselves. So the question is, if we go even lower than that, are we going to start using negative numbers?
Well, and on top of that,
really, that's your big concern, is what we call them.
I was just teaching this to my students, so it was on my mind.
Awesome. Well, it does give it a really interesting timbral change too, having those low strings.
It's this beautiful, like
it's
wooden.
So nice.
It's like this really open. Like I always think it sounds like wood. Almost like a really low marimba or something, but with a lot more sustain. It's really amazing.
But,
so Sam I'm sure has some thoughts on the tech.
Well, the article makes mention of Stewart and Sons, an Australian company, Australian company that makes one with 102 keys.
That's not a piano.
I think we got our show title there.
Right. Oh, definitely.
With 14 extra keys. But, just like in lots of other instrument categories, the people on top have motivation to not change. Because when you change, people think, well, why are they changing? Because they're the best, But people who are underneath the top have a reason to develop and come up with new things. Yeah. So that's why
this is a principle that we call capitalism.
Yes, and that's why, like the article points out also that Steinway doesn't own any patents anymore.
Yes.
Like there's nothing new going on. They've figured out pianos, at least they think, and that's what they're doing. They're not making carbon fiber pianos, which we talked about before the show. They're not making extended range pianos. Aren't they just now starting to get into making electric pianos?
I don't know about electric, but I've seen some of the Disclavier type things on more recent Steinways.
Yeah.
Oh, really? You can do a Disclavier-ish thing on a Steinway. That's interesting. The Disclavier, we should say, for anyone not familiar, is like a digital version of a player piano. It's got a disc, little mounted thing on the underneath side of the keyboard where you can slide in. Originally, when I was in college, it was a floppy disk, and now I'm sure they're all CDs and thumb drives and stuff.
Yeah.
Probably just connect wirelessly to your Wi-Fi.
I was going to say Wi-Fi connectable piano.
And you Bluetooth with your NFC, and you tap your phone and whatever. Yeah. But it also just plays the piano.
Yeah, and it's also like it's a Yamaha thing, the Disclavier.
Yeah, that's true. It's a Disclavier is a Yamaha brand.
Well, you see it on other manufacturers too. I mean, when we did the Patch In episode with Greg Dixon, he was talking about doing that with the Bösendorfer.
Yeah, and they call it something different, but yeah, and I remember Moog had a piano bar that you could like put.
Oh, that thing is so cool.
Keyboard. Yeah, exactly. To give it MIDI capability.
Yeah.
That was only, I guess, an output. So use the piano as a controller. But yeah, obviously installing the mechanics for having computer-controlled playing of the piano, that's a whole other layer of things.
Yeah. The article points out that Steinway is really like playing catch-up when it comes to technology other than just the building of the piano. Yeah. And that Yamaha is really the company when it comes to that, which is no surprise. And I'd like to say that I actually have a clavinova in my office that is being finished right now because it's pretty small, and even a good upright piano would be more space than I would like to have, but it feels good. It feels, I'm sure a concert pianist would think it feels crappy, but to my only moderately educated hands, it feels good. It's got weighted keys. It has 88 of them. It sounds really good. It has good dynamic range. So yeah, and that's actually a great alternative to, I think, even in some cases a better alternative to even a good upright. But yeah, Yamaha
I think these adventurous things that these other manufacturers are doing are really interesting for us as composers as well, because we get to take advantage of those things on pieces that we write, and hopefully, maybe if that extra, 4 or 6 notes at the end of the piano keyboard, if that becomes widely used enough that you could write a piece that used it. Right now, if you write any piece that goes below that, you have to either say you can only perform this piece on, one of 500 pianos in the whole world, or you have to write some other version of it that's not going to be as cool, or is not going to do the thing that you're trying to accomplish with that piece because it can't use the extra notes. And the same thing would be true of any of these other features. And that's kind of true of a lot of extended technique music, though, especially for piano.
Yeah, well, and it's the same thing as when, before you had the standardized 5-octave marimba really coming into prominence, you'd see these pieces by Boulez that call for a bass marimba that basically took the lower part of the 5-octave up a little bit. So,
Yeah, the Joey Calderazzo is quoted in here. He's a jazz pianist, if you don't know. Recorded a lot with Michael Brecker, great player. He talking about the inconsistency in Steinway, and I would like to know if that inconsistency is endemic to all models, or if, because that's another thing I would say, Yamaha saxophones are way more consistent than Selmer saxophones. You get 5 custom EX altos in and play them, they're going to have better intonation and more consistent feeling action than 5 different, super action, brand new Series 3 super actions from Selmer. And I would also like to see, similar to the, and it's actually mentioned in the article, similar to the blind test that was done with new Italian top-end violins versus Stradivarii, and seeing if players actually holding them and playing them couldn't tell the difference with any more frequency than you would have gotten by guessing. I would like to see that done with pianos, although that's a much bigger, more problematic proposition to undertake because of pianos being so expensive and the space problem.
Right. Yeah.
But get on that internet.
Yeah. Speaking of getting on things on the internet, the Conducting Business podcast from WQXR this week continued a discussion that we were having and that a lot of people have been having recently after the premiere of Jennifer Higdon's Cold Mountain and the U.S. premiere of George Benjamin's Written on Skin. Written on Skin by George Benjamin is a little bit more challenging listen, and Higdon's music, as we've discussed on the show before, is much more accessible. And the Benjamin was much more critically well received than the Higdon. And so there's been a lot of discussion about aesthetics in contemporary opera lately. And this is something that we were kind of talking a little bit about last week. And this Conducting Business podcast went a little, I wouldn't say viral because that's a stupid thing to say, but David Gockley, who is the general manager of the San Francisco Opera, was kind of defending nice American accessible opera and saying that he did not think that George Benjamin was for everyone. And he was describing opera as kind of the caricature of bourgeois art that it often gets in cartoons and in popular culture. And he said, this is a quote from this podcast, he says, "Its musical language is extraordinarily complicated. I mean, are you going to sit and play that at dinner?"
Is that the goal?
Me personally,
I wouldn't play any opera at dinner because that's not what opera is for.
Yes.
Though, actually, as I say that, we were listening to some opera at dinner last night, but that's not the point. We weren't actually listening to it. It was just nice background music. And you know what?
Like
we were listening to music that I would never sit down and actually attend an opera performance of. There was like Donizetti on in the background, and it was lovely as Donizetti in the background, but I'm not going to see a performance of Anna Bolena ever because it's boring.
Yeah. That's like saying your goal as a composer should be to write music that is not offensive if you decide to listen to it, but completely ignorable if you decide not to listen to it while it's playing, which is stupid.
I call it the undergraduate paradox.
Well, there are plenty of very with it undergraduates, and it's not a matter of it being pretty or not. It's a matter of what the art form is for. And I think it was clear to me also that David Gockley really didn't understand a lot of art, I guess, because he at one point described the George Benjamin as postmodernist modernism.
What is that? That doesn't mean anything.
It means stuff I don't understand, and so we'll assign some aesthetic words that I've heard other people use to describe other things that I don't understand.
Yeah.
Please don't ask me any questions about art. That's what it means.
To me, that suggests, like a lot of people who are very much into, beautiful, air quotes, opera, it's like if it's not beautiful in the way they think things should be beautiful, they don't even care to think about it at all. And
here's the sad thing, though. This guy he's in his 10th year as the general manager of the San Francisco Opera, and before that he was running the Houston Grand Opera, which is one of the other major opera companies in the United States.
Yeah.
And this is the guy who makes the decisions.
Now there are some salient points I think that he makes. Let's leave aside his aesthetic point of view, and he says you should make things of a modest scale. If you're a composer who wants to get something performed, make it of a modest scale and the ability to be performed by young singers. Now that reads to me as not complicated harmonically, but there's something to be taken away from that. If you can make yourself happy enough and keep the singing easier to sing, we all know from a practical point of view, it's more likely to get performed, and more likely to get performed more than once if it's smaller, easier to put on, and easier to sing.
I mean, that's the balance that everybody, like all composers, have to find their way through, is, like having it be super practical to do and having it be a really different idea or a different proposition that hasn't been done before.
Yeah.
And you gotta, every time you're looking at your piece, you have to think, if I make this change, will I make the work easier or harder to play, and will I make the work significantly different? And if you can make it a little bit easier or even significantly easier and get mostly the same idea across, I think it's worth doing.
Yeah.
I mean, there is something to be said for having the occasional technical challenge in there, especially if it's a piece that's designed to raise the performance level of the performers.
Right.
I mean, if you're writing in an educational context, you're not going to want to have everything just being in simple 4/4 time at 120 with nice, happy scalar patterns.
No, and Sam and I have discussed this before a lot, that half of the point of writing a concerto or a sonata is to make somebody play something that sounds impressive, and a lot of times that means hard.
Yeah.
But that's a different sort of thing than writing for an opera company, and I think there are some things you can do, but at the same time you have to strike a balance, because you can make it too easy, and if it's too easy, it's very difficult to make something that's very easy sound not boring.
Well, there is a question that I have though about how easy do you need to make it, not just for the performers but for the audience. I mean, Gockley is talking about the premiere of Little Women, which he says is popular due to its recognizable title, modest scale, and its ability to be performed by younger singers.
Yeah.
And this idea that you need to make it easy for the performers and then recognizable for the audience by taking something that they're already familiar with and doing an opera of that.
Yeah.
I mean, do we really need to essentially get into the same problem that you have with movie studios rehashing and rebooting franchises and doing endless sequels just to make it palatable to audiences?
Well, I mean, they're dealing with the same issue, though. Putting on an opera is a big, expensive deal. We talked about this last week. So, there are genuine, big-time financial things at stake, and, if they have a formula that works, and it's going to put butts in the seats, and it's going to keep the donors keep donating, it's hard to break from that if it's working. There are some interesting numbers in this, and anytime we talk about, like, opera, also with orchestra performances, but way more with opera, anytime there's numbers broken down in some way, it always just shocks me. A 2015 study by Opera America, of the 589 operas premiered in the last 20 years, just 71, that's 11%, have received subsequent revivals. What's that?
Sam, I lost everything you just said because I dropped the call.
Okay. According to a 2015 study by Opera America,
like from the very beginning of what you just said to Ben.
There are some interesting numbers in this piece. Every time we read something about opera, especially classical music generally, but opera especially, and they break down numbers, it's always fascinating to me because it's always even more, whatever the thing is that you have an issue with, it's even worse than you might imagine. According to a 2015 study by Opera America, of the 589 operas that were premiered over the last 20 years, just 71, that's 11%, received subsequent revivals. That is a tiny number. And give that a context going back in history, and I had no idea this was the case. In the years of the 1780s, over 1,000 operas a year were premiered. But only a few, including Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni, have stood the test of time, which to me suggests that sort of it's historically the thing for opera to be written, put on, and then usually forgotten thereafter.
Yeah. Well, and there are famous operas that were not popular in the years when they were first performed, and even for decades later. I mean, look at Carmen. That was a notorious flop, and then didn't become popular until it was revived a couple decades later.
Did not know that.
Speaking of Carmen, did you know that Bizet wrote other things as well?
The Pearl Fishers.
The Metropolitan Opera is doing one of his other operas this season, and you can watch it in movie theaters. I was just looking at their schedule yesterday.
Nice.
Very nice.
We're getting along pretty well into the show, so I want to move on to some interesting discussion that we've been having over the last few days. Kind of spurred by a post on our friend Drew McManus's Adaptistration blog about full-time composition departments in orchestras. And this is different from a composer in residence who is kind of on a contract to create certain amounts of things and is just going to fulfill those roles, but is not really around very much, and is not a full-time member of the orchestra the way that any player is a full-time member of the orchestra. What do you guys think of having your violin section and your viola section and your composition section?
I'm all for it.
Fantastic idea.
Yeah.
But it's hard to imagine it happening considering that orchestras are charity organizations. They operate only through charity.
Right.
Yeah. I can see this happening a lot more in Europe, where they have a lot of state sponsorship, but yeah, definitely in the U.S., this is going to be a hard sell to a lot of places.
Now, it's also worth pointing out that I forgot his name now, but at a conference once I was talking to a composer from England, and his take on state sponsoring of arts and specifically related to composition is that it's much harder to get something off the ground and funded in the United States, but when it happens, you're generally able to make it more whatever you want it to be. And in Great Britain, it's way more possible to get something, but you have to capitulate to the fact that you're going to get like 3 rehearsals, which is an interesting limitation to operate under, but that's the way it works, at least according to him.
To be fair, 3 rehearsals from an orchestra would be more than they usually afford to new music pieces.
Yeah.
So,
well, it depends how long. They usually divvy things up in minutes.
Right.
But yeah, it's not great.
Mhm.
What's interesting about it, and this is kind of Drew's perspective as a business consultant, is the role of the composer in all of the other business of the orchestra, and where a composition chair in the orchestra fits into the structure of the collective bargaining agreement, and where that could, you know, affect the significance of composition within the orchestra by giving that person a seat at the table where they're actually negotiating the deal. Right now, even in orchestras that have composers in residence, that person is not actually involved in the business side of the orchestra the way that the musicians, as representatives of the musicians union, are. And so there's not any kind of you know, there's no real leverage in programming a season that these people have, or they have no relationship to the day-to-day operations of the organization.
You're just an independent contractor if you're the composer in residence.
Right. Yeah. You're just the hired help.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'm not an orchestra insider, but my feel for it is that orchestras and the management of orchestras have zero interest in changing that model. They don't want composers to have any say in what goes on.
Why do you say that?
Well, they're not interested in performing new music generally, or their lack of interest in performing new music would suggest that having a composer on staff is not something they would support.
I think there are a lot of orchestra musicians who would be into that.
Well, orchestral musicians who would be into that, but not necessarily orchestral donors or audience members.
Well, we'll find some new ones.
Well, we have to.
We're going to have to find some new donors because the old donors are dying at an alarming rate.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why
Kickstart or Patreon fund the next big orchestra.
Right. Well, and that's why I'm always impressed with groups like the Boston New Music Initiative, who are putting together these concerts and bringing together ensembles with composers, or creating a ensemble specifically to play new music.
Yeah, shout out to our friends at Symphony No. 1 in Baltimore, who are working on another crowdfunding campaign right now.
Mm-hmm. I posted it on our social media machine.
Yeah, but I've seen a lot of this, recently. I can't remember where the article was, but they were talking about some of the hated practices in going to the symphony yet again, and especially, I think it was leader recitals. The idea that you can't applaud in between pieces, that you have to sit perfectly still, and that, God forbid, they actually serve a beer in the audience. Just other things that could help make the concert-going experience more accessible, and then that would draw in the type of people who would want to hear more new music as opposed to the standard war horses.
Yeah. If there were more outlets for composers to write more orchestral pieces, what the article calls music, of now, related to culture as it is now, I think you would end up getting a lot more music that your general audience would find palatable. As it is, if a composer gets the chance to write an orchestral piece, it has to be a thing, It has to be, this is my chance at doing something gigantic, so I'm going to try and make my composition brain as happy as possible with this very limited opportunity. If it were more common, pieces wouldn't be, I don't think that I, as a composer, would feel as much pressure to make it, a groundbreaking something. It would just be an orchestral piece. The same way, Mozart wrote hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pieces, and not every one it was a nail-biting masterpiece that he, it was just a piece.
Heresy. Everything Mozart does is wonderful.
That's right. Oh, what's the top Kerschel number? Does anybody know?
660 something.
It's pretty high. I was going to say in the upper 500s, but there could be 600s. I don't know.
I know there's a 600.
That does bring up an interesting issue, though, which is at the time that Mozart was writing, he was the popular type of music.
Yeah.
So does this necessitate that maybe we move away from purely orchestral forces and start focusing more on the chamber music, or even on more event-specific types of music that we compose?
Event-specific types
Like
of music,
dance music?
I think.
No. I'm thinking event-specific, like if you have a specific ensemble that has an interesting combination of instruments that is doing a set of concerts.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, perhaps, and certainly we've talked about the kind of explosion of very exciting chamber music on the show before, but I think there's still room. I guess I would hate for this new focus on chamber music to mean that we just give up on orchestral music.
Right.
Because obviously there are lots of cool things you can do with a big orchestra that you can't do with 6 or 8 players. And, we should say that actually at the end of Drew's post on Adaptistration, his kicker is that composition chairs in bands and orchestras exist already, and they exist in the U.S. military ensembles, and their title is usually staff arranger, but they do a lot of original composition as well.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them also actually play in the ensembles, though.
Yeah. The largest employer of musicians in the United States, U.S. military.
Perhaps in the world.
Perhaps in the world.
Wouldn't you guess?
I would imagine, considering how big the United States is.
So
Look into that, Internet.
Yeah, correct me, because I'm the one that got that wrong, if anybody got it wrong. And my Twitter handle is @housegoy. So is that gonna wrap us for today? Oh, we should mention the
very
passing.
sad obituary.
Yeah, we should mention the passing of the wonderful and brilliant Oliver Sacks from liver cancer, I believe. And he wrote a wonderful book about music cognition about 7 or 8 years ago called Musicophilia that you should check out if that's a topic that interests you, how our brains process sounds and music. It's called Musicophilia. We'll have a link to it in the show notes. But he was just a really smart guy, a really smart doctor, and did a lot of work to bring very sophisticated science to a very large audience, and to help people understand how their brains work and process information that comes into them. And that's obviously something that we as composers are trying to manipulate all the time. And so reading and listening to the works of Oliver Sacks have, I think, informed a lot of music composition, and a lot of composers have taken his words to heart and mind over the last 15 or 20 years that he's been so popular in the music cognition community.
Yeah, good piano player.
Really?
To me it's like giving a more accurate and richer vocabulary to talk about music cognition in a way that I kind of already thought about it before. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Which is sort of like music theory is. It's just giving you a more sophisticated way to talk about something that you kind of have inside your brain already.
Yeah, absolutely.
He will be missed, and kept writing and being just as feisty and ferocious about everything right until the very end.
Yeah, and after his liver cancer diagnosis, he knew that he wasn't going to be around much longer, and was very open about it. And he was always very open about his own personal issues and the science around his own body and his own mind, which I think was very freeing to a lot of other people trying to engage some really difficult issues as well. So he will certainly be missed. That's going to do it for this week's episode of SoundNotion. My name is David McDonald. I'm with Ben Furman, Nate Blyton, and Sam Merciers. You can follow us as a group on Twitter. We're at SoundNotion. Individually, I'm at Dave McDowell. Ben is at B Furman. Nate is at A Nate Tree. Sam is at Housegoy. And you can find links to all of the stories that we talked about, and you could also leave a comment there at soundnotion.tv/SN. And while you're there, you should check out some of our other fine shows on the SoundNotion network, including Patch In, which is something about electronic music or something with Ben and Nate. So some excellent work being done all around, not just on this show, but some other shows on this network as well. So if you are subscribing to things, you should subscribe to all of the things. And if you subscribe to them, you should go review them in the iTunes store, because that helps people find us. That helps us out a lot.
And real quick, Dave, since we've got both of the Patch In guys here, I want to say congratulations, because every time I hear about one of your new guests coming up, I'm like, what? What? You got who? Are we the New York Times all of a sudden that we get this person on our show? So if you're into electronic music, I mean, they have had some serious guests.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's
Absolutely
been all
good
Ben's work getting the good guests and everything. So, yeah.
I got really lucky with some of those people that they actually responded to my emails.
I have a request.
Okay.
Paul
Yes.
Lansky.
Paul
Oh
Lansky.
God, I wish.
So, dude, you've gotten
I've got to get him on.
Puckett and Subotnick. I don't think
Yeah.
Lansky is a huge
Ooh.
stretch.
Miller freaking Puckett.
So that's going to do it for this
Great
week's
guy.
episode of SoundNotion. And next week you should probably just listen to Patch In instead. Thanks again so much for watching or listening, and we will see you back next week.
Go Green.
Go White.
Go State.
Yeah,
That was fun, guys.
We managed to best, who was it, Eastern Michigan yesterday?
Oh, nice.
Western Michigan.